Welcome back, CFP. I said welcome back, CFP. Thank you. It's been a little bit buttoned down up to now. Ed Hasbrook not wearing tie-dye. We'll look for him to wear it tomorrow, he says. CFP is a very special conference to me, and as good an illustration as any is the fact that you can have a panel entitled "Do Not Track, Yay or Boo." A thank you to the organizers of CFP this year, particularly Lily, for lots of work. I saw lots of emails, and the hours of the emails were distinctive as well. All hours of the day and night. And Jules Polonetsky as well for what he's done to put this thing together. Thank you for being here. Thanks to all my panelists. We are going to do a modified debate here. The title, Yay or Boo, is really, if there's a serious point to it, it's to mock the kinds of debates that we have in Washington, D.C. They tend to be highly partisan, very uninformed. They have the characteristic of children fighting in the sandbox. but the actors act very self-important. And what we're going to do, is we're going to try and switch that up, and we're going to embrace a stupidly partisan tone. Is anyone in favor of that? Yay! Who's against it? Nobody. Good answer. We're going to embrace a stupidly partisan tone, abandon the pretense of self-importance, and hopefully the converse will result, which is an informative discussion that gets everybody better aware of Do Not Track, what it is, how it works, what it's about, should we have it or not. A loose agenda is we're going to talk about how we got to the Do Not Track proposal, talk about Do Not Track as a technical matter, what has to happen for Do Not Track to work, and then the real heart of the issue is why. How are we better off with Do Not Track? I have seated our panelists in a way consistent with the formation of this debate. On my left, and of course they would be on the left, is the Yay team. Do Not Track Yay. Let's hear it for them. This is not setting up well for my colleagues on the right. On my right, the Coke-funded corporate whores. Thank you. Opposition to Do Not Track in a way. Let's hear it for them. No, they should get a yay. They should get a yay. You have the bios in front of you. I don't need to explain who everybody is, but I'll go from left to right. Chris Soghoian, Harlan Yu, Ed Felton. I'm Jim Harper. This is Andy Ziegler, Berin Szoka, Ryan Radia. Ed works for the Federal Trade Commission, so he will now deliver the obligatory, I work for the government and I'm not saying what the government thinks.
I work for the government and I'm not saying what the government thinks.
Thank you, Ed. Well done. Well done. So Yay team, and we'll hear from Boo team as well. How did we get to where we are? Why is Do Not Track an important proposal? What's been going on up to now in terms of controlling the internet advertising industry's access to information to people excessively much? So, Chris, go.
So I'm not going to go into how companies track you online. That's a larger issue. But I will say that many responsible companies have offered consumers a means to opt out of online tracking. For the last several years, this has been effectuated through an opt-out cookie that a consumer gets from an advertising network's website. There are hundreds of advertising networks that offer opt-out cookies, and so in addition to that, there were industry organizations like the Network Advertising Initiative that tried to offer a one-stop shop to consumers. You could go to the NAI website, click Select All, and get some opt-outs. The problem there is that there are only a few members of the NAI, and so there were still hundreds of opt-out cookies that you would have to get elsewhere on the web. And so actually, 2 years ago at CFP in DC, I guess in 2009, I had just released a plugin for the Firefox web browser called Taco that tried to pull a bunch of these opt-out cookies together into one place. TACO was an interesting proof of concept, as the goal was to sort of show how difficult the industry had built the current system. Right, ad companies wanted to offer an opt-out so they could go before regulators and say, we have delivered consumers a means to use choice or to get choice, but they didn't actually want it to be that easy to use.
Wait a second, Chris, is that true? I mean, is that really true? Is everyone agreed that that's why the network advertisers did that? Was because they wanted to have something to say, or did they actually want to protect privacy? Blue side?
I mean,
are they being ingenuine when they put this together?
Within a year of TACO coming out, suddenly the Network Advertising Initiative had their own clone of TACO. Google has their own opt-out tool that lets you get a bunch of opt-out cookies. So it wasn't an amazing concept. It was something that was thrown together over a weekend.
Well, Jim, if I may here, I think it's a mistake to focus on intention. I mean, the fact is that Chris did something good. This is part of, when we talk about self-regulation, we don't just mean, industry people getting together and being angelic and doing good things for consumers. We mean a very complicated mess of things that happen, including annoying people like Chris, who do things that I think in many ways are very good, right? So shaming companies and calling them bad privacy practices is part of the process that I think we see as an alternative to heavy-handed regulation, and that includes going out and building tools just like the one that Chris built. And Chris is going to roll his eyes here when I say this, but we at the same time, when I was at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, with our complete lack of technical skills, basically tried to do something similar to what Chris did, building upon Google's persistent opt-out plugin. And Chris did it far, far better and got it adopted, and I see that as a success. So I don't think it's really worth sitting around thinking, well, would they have done this if Chris hadn't lit a fire under them, because Chris did. And that's part of the process that I see working here.
You see how, as your moderator, I'm trying to engender the debate that we're really looking for. Chris, you're a market actor whether you want to be or not. Ha ha. But continue.
All right, so I'm glad that Berin at least recognized that the TACO-style cookie options or cookie tools were a move in the right direction, but clearly not a sufficient solution. So ad networks track people via cookies. They track people via flash cookies. Some have been using other techniques such as browser history sniffing, fingerprinting most recently. And in some cases, with those other technologies, there were ways for consumers to opt out. In some cases, there are no means for consumers to opt out. And so the latest technique that ad companies use to track consumers is called browser fingerprinting. This is a way of detecting which computer has visited your site based on unique differences in that browser, which fonts have you installed on your system, in which order have you installed those fonts, which plugins, which versions of plugins, and that kind of thing. And it's important to know that none of the existing privacy controls in the browser, clearing your cookies, clearing your cache, deleting your browsing history, none of those things will address browser fingerprinting. And so one of the main reasons that folks at this table and others in this room really sort of gathered around and embraced the idea of the do not track header, which is something that's now built into 3 of the 4 browsers. I wish Google would add it to theirs, is that it finally allows you to say no to all tracking, regardless of which technology is being used to track you, whether it's cookies, whether it's flash cookies, whether it's cache, whether it's browser history, whether it's fingerprint-based. This is a single method by which consumers can tell ad companies they don't want to be tracked.
Let me interrupt you there, Chris, because I want to hear from Ryan Radia, who's written some about various measures people can take to protect themselves. Ryan, you've written on the Tech Liberation Front blog recently about some things. What are other things? What are the variety of behaviors, activities, things that people can do to protect themselves from tracking various ways, even if they're not a complete solution?
There are lots of technologies that lots of people use. For instance, Firefox add-ons like NoScript and AdBlock can reduce tracking. But there are no silver bullets. The technologies that are necessary to prevent you from being tracked online are imperfect. But that's because there is a huge incentive to use your information for a variety of ways, both beneficial and in some cases harmful. The problem with do not track, and the browser fingerprinting is an excellent example of this, is that it doesn't actually prevent anyone from tracking the fingerprint of your browser, except for a very limited subset of actors, third-party networks, and except for third parties that use your information for analytics purposes.
All right, we're going to come back.
Can I just make a point of clarification?
Sure.
I just want to make sure everyone, this is not an argument, but everyone here understands that really this is not about tracking, it's about use specification. In other words, do not track is do not collect my data for certain purposes. And I think we'll have a better conversation if we're all clear on that, and the technologists can probably explain that better than I can.
Yeah, and I do want to get to the sort of the meat of exactly what do not track is supposed to do, but the way we've come to this is everybody is saying, stop tracking. Well, we do have to figure out what that is. But one of the grown-ups in the room, Ed Felton, has asked to speak. Ed?
Actually, I wanted to ask Andy to speak, because you guys, Microsoft has a technology that that is effective in giving consumers choice, right?
Right. So
I thought I was the moderator. Andy?
I'm about to invite him over to our side.
I'd happily join. So tracking protection is a feature in Internet Explorer that's similar to, it's a do not track feature, essentially, but the primary difference is that instead of sending a header to websites, which is kind of like a signal of intent that says I don't want to be tracked, tracking protection actually enforces the user's choice. So as everybody knows, websites are connected. They have links. They have embedded content. A lot of that content's great, and it provides a lot of the innovative experiences that are on the web, like maps and advertisements, images, lots of things. But there's a privacy and a security impact to including that content in your website. So when you go to, for instance, wallstreetjournal.com, your address bar says wallstreetjournal.com, but you're really including content from tens to hundreds of different websites, and every time you do that, you share a little bit of information.
Can I ask you to flesh that out? Lots of people, especially up on this panel, already know how all that stuff works. Can you tell us, just for the people who aren't sophisticated about Internet Protocol and browsers, what's going on? Third-party material on websites, what's happening there?
So everybody's familiar with the concept that a web page has links and that there's hypertext, and that's how the World Wide Web got popular. But it's a little less obvious when you go to a website that it's actually, you go to a page, you get the page like from Wall Street Journal, but that page says, hey, get this content from all these other different websites. And that's super powerful. It means that if you want to see, for instance, a Google map on a website that's not Google, you can have that map embedded right in the page. But that process kind of happens automatically. So when you go to a page, it doesn't say, hey, user, is it okay if we go to contact all these different websites? It just automatically happens. So what tracking protection does is allows users to get something.
I want to take it just a little bit further. When all those websites see you visiting lots of different places, Facebook is one. It might be Google that has code on a lot of different websites. They get an insight into your travels on the web that's much more broad than any one website. So that's an important sense of tracking that people work on protecting. So sorry, please continue.
Right, that's a great point. And as Chris mentioned, there's a variety of different techniques that are used to track you. But the core issue is that when you go to Wall Street Journal, then you go to Blockbuster, and then you go to New York Times, if all those websites include the same content from the same third party, then they have like a line of sight into the fact that you've gone to these different places. So tracking protection lets users get tracking protection lists. So these are things that anybody can write, any privacy advocate, anybody in this room. If you don't want to write one, you can encourage somebody else to write one, or you can share a link to one. After a user has one, when you go to a website, all the third-party content in the page is filtered against the user's tracking protection lists. And if the tracking protection list says, hey, I don't include this content from this third-party site because it's tracking content, then Internet Explorer will just not load that content. So regardless of the specific tracking mechanism used, whether it's cookies or e-tag, cache header things, or the panopticlick style thing, it doesn't matter because the network request isn't actually going to the third party.
Jim, if I can just make another point of clarification here, the way I think about this is that it's essentially a do not load mechanism, and it is in some sense similar to the way that, as Ryan was saying, that AdBlock Plus works, where you have whitelists and blacklists that tell your browser what to load and what not to load, and those can include tracking elements. And so it's in that indirect way that this is a do not track mechanism.
But I think it's fair to say that the leading proposal right now is actually to put a signal in the header that I'm going to ask Harlan you to explain about. The header is the data that your browser sends out calling for information. So if you can go into more about what the header is and how the header signal would work.
Sure. First of all, I think I want to try to push back just a little bit about the tracking protection list and the idea that where you could basically use AdBlock Plus to block the loads of third-party content. In some ways, as compared to do not track, which I'll talk about soon, tracking protection lists in some ways is a sledgehammer. From a commercial standpoint, it may seem that just blocking the load itself might be doing too much. It's in some ways a very inflexible mechanism because if you don't load the third-party domain, then the tracking company, can't decide how to actually serve that ad. So in some cases, the company will want to serve a behavioral ad, but if they get the do not track header, that company could fall back to something that's less harmful from a privacy standpoint, and maybe serve a contextual ad and not actually collect any of that personal information.
That sounds like an in-your-face, Andy. Go on, Harlan.
And I mean, so just looking at it I think it's a great privacy technology, but I think from a commercial standpoint, in some ways it might do a little too much, and I don't think that the advertising companies would prefer that as much as a do not track mechanism that might be more flexible.
So I don't want to present tracking protection as an alternative necessarily to the do not track header. Like, I was actually, one of the authors of the W3C spec that actually defined the header that we didn't invent the header, but we decided, hey, look, this is a great technology. Let's get this into a standards body and start iterating on it. They both have pros and cons. I think sledgehammer is a little bit of, a heavy word. You can, filter out a specific thing on a domain. It's not that you block a whole, third-party domain. But, I mean, to your point, I think one of the things that we'll talk about later is that do not track is very difficult to define. It's a very complex and nuanced issue to figure out. And I don't think that there is a common understanding of what do not track means at this point. I think that the cookies today from NAI and industry mean do not target. And I'm sure there's somebody else here who can comment on whether or not that's an effective representation of what they do now. But to a user, I think, so I come from the perspective of we build features for users, and we have to be able to clearly communicate what the feature does. And I can say that, if I don't load a particular third-party tracking item, that the user is not tracked. And I think that's clear. So that's kind of where we erred on the side of being clear.
I think Harlan was pretty kind not to say nuclear option. So Sledgehammer was moderate compared to that. But I do want to hear about HTTP and how it works.
Sure. So the idea behind do not track is that right now users and third-party tracking companies are essentially engaged in an arms race. As Chris was saying, there are many companies doing this online. There are many different actual tracking technologies, and the existing opt-outs are not only difficult to use, they're not always effective, and consumers shouldn't have to be experts in computer security and privacy to really understand how to block tracking online when they want it. So the idea behind do not track is to add an HTTP header to requests when the consumer decides. So do not track is a browser option that's built into the browser that is essentially an opt-out mechanism. And when the user goes to the user preferences and checks, I would not like to be tracked by third parties online, what the browser will do is to add an HTTP header to all third-party requests. And what that does is it just signals to the tracking companies that the user's preference that they don't want to be tracked. And then the onus is up to the server to actually not use any of the various tracking technologies to do the tracking. And I think the debate really is about what these policies should be. When a server receives the header, what are the obligations for the server and how that's enforced.
And we're going to come to that soon. In the meantime, Chris is asking to speak.
Yeah, so we're going to have a debate here today, and the folks on the far right of the table are going to be they're going to be giving you an argument against the do not track header, and they're going to say that consumers have tools in their hands right now, all these third-party plugins for browsers that you can use, and they're going to say that that's enough. And what I want you to remember is that this isn't a debate about do not track versus all those other browser privacy controls, the clearing of the cookies, and the ad network provided privacy options. This is a debate between the do not track header that still lets ad companies deliver contextual ads, or a world where the only effective privacy technology is AdBlock Plus, where no ads are served at all? It's the nuclear option or the reasonable option. And those guys are going to try and make it seem like there's another option, which is that consumers can have, opt-out cookies, and tools like TACO do, some reasonable privacy things for consumers who care enough to spend 5 hours downloading all these browser plugins. But that's not a real debate, and that's not how this is really shaping up. If they continue to try and haggle these issues down and then haggle the definition of do not track and what tracking means and what browsing means and blah, 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 consumers will use either AdBlock Plus or Microsoft's track and protection list feature, and then no ads are served at all.
Shame on you, Booz, for even thinking about what you're about to say.
Can I jump in here, Jim? So, I just should say for the audience's sake that Chris and I are best frenemies. There are a few people in the world that I enjoy debating with as much as Chris. But I'm sorry to say that Chris actually, I don't think, knows my mind very well here, and I don't think he's read my FTC comments.
And weren't they really long?
No, not that long, Chris. Certainly not as long as your Lost in the Cloud, whatever 80-page paper that was. But I would cite here, if you haven't seen the famous Keynes-Hayek rap video, I recommend this to all of you. It is the single best depiction of the great economic debate of our times, as rendered in a very well-produced rap video. And there's one key line here that I think really summarizes my own position, which is where Russ Roberts at George Mason University, a very respected economist and host of the wonderful show Econ Talk, who wrote the lyrics, has Hayek say, "I don't want to do nothing. There's plenty to do. The question I ponder is plans for whom? Do I plan for myself or leave it to you? I want plans by the many, not plans by the few." So in other words, I mean, he's talking about economic planning generally, but my point here about privacy is, again, I don't want to do nothing. There's plenty to do. My message over the last 3 years, working with Adam Thier sitting here in the audience, has been one of user empowerment. And so in a very real way, I'm delighted that we're sitting here today talking about user empowerment tools, and indeed that we're debating about more than one user empowerment tool, because ultimately what I'd like to see happen is for there to be a mosaic of user empowerment tools that start, many of them, with browser plugins and add-ons, and iterate over time into better tools that maybe get built into browsers. So my point is not that we should do nothing, and my point is not that we should make things really difficult for users, but the fundamental debate that you'll really hear today is not the one that Chris just laid out. I think he's setting up a straw man. The debate is really about plans by the many or plans by the few. In other words, are we going to let this process evolve through the normal internet standard setting process in which many actors participate and there are competing values at stake and we work out a standard that makes sense for everybody? Or are we going to have the government, through legislation, dictate how this is going to work? Or more subtly, because I think that's less likely to happen, or more subtly and more dangerously, have government put its finger on the scales of this process in such a way as that nobody can ever say, well, the government is dictating this particular solution, but in fact they are actually driving how the technology evolves. Because I oppose very strongly both of those latter two, and that's essentially what Chris wants. So please don't mistake me. I really do believe that what we need here is a solution that empowers privacy-sensitive users to make decisions for themselves. But when we do that, we have to really understand that there are real trade-offs. That Chris is very fond of saying, "Your broken business model is not my problem," and I think that exhibits his basic attitude, which is one of dismissiveness. So I would like to combine both a seriousness about user empowerment and also a seriousness about the stakes here, and an understanding that what's at stake is not just funding for advertising, but also the collection of data that's used to target and tailor messaging, not just by people who want to sell you toothpaste, but also non-commercial messengers who want to show you a political ad or an ad for a nonprofit, and all forms of commercial as well as non-commercial speech.
All right, I'm going to make a blanket announcement to all our panelists that if you're willing to drop a rhyme, I will go to you right away. So, Berin, good work. Ed, let's talk. We've been touching on this here and there. What the rules would have to be if we have a signal in the header. Can you tell me about process first before we get to what the rules should be? How does the regulatory process work for the many in the audience who don't deal with this day by day?
Well, there's an active debate going on right now, and a lot of stakeholders are talking about this. There have been events to talk about exactly what principles should would underlie a header-based do-not-track system. There have been discussions from industry about what principles they would like to adopt. There are others who have shot back and said that's not enough. This is exactly the kind of debate that we should be having. The stakeholders are talking about it. I see movement toward consensus. And I think there's a very good chance that a consensus will be reached and that we'll end up with a system that gets to that ultimate goal that I think all of us, I hear that all of us support, which is giving consumers an effective choice about whether they're tracked online against their will.
That sounds like closing remarks, Ed. We need to talk right now about what the regulatory process would be to get there. Let's say you have a signal and 15%, 60%, 75% of consumers have a signal in the browser that says do not track. Before we even get to what that means, what's the process legally at the FTC, maybe in Congress, to get that kind of thing to work? Who wants it? Who wants it?
First of all, let me just be really clear here that I do believe in user empowerment, but I also believe that a no-cost opt-out is not scalable. And so what really has to happen here is first of all...
That's a technical assertion?
And scalable for whom? For the ad network?
No. Scalable in an economic sense. I mean, there are a number of different threads here. So I just want to be clear that there are several conversations that are happening here. There's a technical conversation where the folks on the left here are vastly more qualified than myself to tell you technical details, all of them. There's a policy conversation, which is the one that we're starting to get into. There's an economic conversation about the trade-offs here, right? And it's not just, again, I want to emphasize, it's not just about ad revenue. It's also about the ability of people to target messaging, right? I just want to be very clear about that. So when I say that a no-cost opt-out isn't scalable, I'm referring back to Chris's concept about breaking business models. So, I mean, we can get into this particular thing right now if you want to, but this is a big topic to unpack. So, Jim, do you want me to?
Your moderator, folks, is doing a terrible job because he's trying to get an answer to the question, how does legislation and regulation work, which is probably a step that's required for a do not track.
So let me start with the easiest thing. The one thing that everyone here would agree on is that if a company makes a representation that they will abide by a do not track header and fails to do so, that it's an unfair and deceptive trade practice and the FTC should go after them. There's no debate here about that. So the question, I think, is that adequate? And what more should the FTC or other government actors do? And I think the real debate comes in perhaps in two key questions. The first is whether there should be a legislative mandate to use a do not track header, and then the second is whether there's one. What I mean by that is really to build it into the browser. Okay. So is it in the browser, and then how does it work? Is it turned on by default? What does tracking mean? All of those things get rolled into that. That's one question.
Berin, we don't need that because it's already in 3 of the 4 browsers. I mean, legislation isn't going to happen this year. It's not. No, anyone who thinks it's happening is confused. We're not going to have anything out of the FTC. So this is really about what companies are willing to do voluntarily.
So let me finish.
Companies have done it already.
So, Chris, so the second question is whether a user's expression through the do not track header is essentially binding on a company, such that a company's failure to abide by that is an unfair or deceptive trade practice that can be punished. Right.
Let me ask Ed first. Ed, true that a company that says it's going to do something is under FTC authority can be held responsible?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it, if a company makes a direct promise to their consumers and then breaks that promise in a way that harms consumers, the FTC will be interested.
Okay, the FTC will be interested. The FTC will take it under advisement.
Yeah, and I would only say here that there are a few areas where I actually you might be surprised to hear me say we'll come out and say we need more FTC enforcement. And one of them is, and it is directly relevant here, is it is striking to me that the FTC has never, to my knowledge, gone out and enforced using its existing authority against a company that makes a P3P, that is a machine-readable disclosure of their privacy policy. They've never gone after a company and said, what you're doing is either inconsistent with your actual practice or it's inconsistent with your written policy. And I'm troubled by that because it does make me worry that we're in a situation where the FTC is not really fully using the tools that it already has. And many people in Washington are rushing forward and saying, well, we need to have new regulatory mandates and new legislation. So I really believe that the first place we should start is the enforcement of existing laws, user empowerment and education, which is exactly the same approach that we take more generally in the context of child safety and parental controls, which is actually fundamentally very similar to this debate, because in that case we're basically talking about not loading content. So I think there's a principled way to approach both things that begins with asking what tools exist today, how can we use them effectively, and what more do we need to solve real problems?
Let me ask you, Ed, what tools exist today? I forget what he just said, but...
It didn't rhyme. I'm sorry, Jim.
Yeah.
So where are we? Let's go to that. Do we need legislation? If we want do not track. And we're actually going to come back, I think, to the economic argument, which Berin has referred to.
I don't think it's the case that legislation is the only way to get to a do not track system. We've heard a bunch of discussion about how this could happen in a voluntary way. We've seen movement from the browser companies to incorporate technologies. As Chris said, 3 of the 4 major browser companies will have or soon will have do not track related technologies. And we're starting to see a few ad networks talk about voluntarily adopting a do not track system. And of course, the tracking protection list that Andy talked about is not something that an ad company has to adopt in order for it to function for the consumer. So we're seeing experimentation in this area. We're seeing technologies getting rolled out. We're seeing discussions about how to comply. We're seeing a lot of discussion about what may happen. And so I think there's a reasonable likelihood that industry will and other stakeholders will come to an agreement that gives consumers what they need. I'm an optimist that can happen. And that's one of the ways we can get to an effective do not track system. It may also be the case that that doesn't happen and Congress loses its patience and that we do get legislation.
Let me send it down to Ryan for comments. Ryan, you're a techie whiz kid. Have you spent any time with tracking protection? What's your sense of it, if that's what you want to talk about? Well, sometimes we ask open-ended questions.
The word that Ed used in describing the move to do not track by industry as voluntary, I think, is somewhat flawed. Clearly, there's a great deal of interest by some in Congress to regulate this industry. The risk is that first, if all of industry moves lockstep to try to avoid regulation, that we end up with a situation that can easily become the law of the land. It's not at all clear that, as Berin mentioned, cost-free opt-out is a good thing. It might mean that we would move from the implicit quid pro quo on the internet today to an explicit quid pro quo, which creates a whole series of new transaction costs involving how content online is funded. The notion of do not track as a regulatory principle and the threat that government will impose it may be steering us in a direction that is harmful to consumers. We don't have a cost-free opt-out today in many cases, but that was the product of a series of voluntary choices. We need better technologies, as Berin mentioned.
You're raising hackles over here, Ryan.
So
I
wanted to ask, you talked about there being an implicit quid pro quo today, that when you go to a website, you are implicitly agreeing to practices. What practices are you agreeing to implicitly? Arbitrary information collection or arbitrary use, or is there a limit to what you think that you're agreeing to just by visiting the site?
I think you're agreeing to the information that is shared with the website being used for purposes.
The first party or
website,
also third parties that are on that website?
And let me ask a question. So when consumers, last year we found out that several websites were abusing browser flaws to dig through people's browsing history. So if you went to YouPorn, one of the top 100 popular websites on the net, sort of the YouTube for porn.
Who would ever do that, Chris?
If you went to YouPorn, they would dig through your browsing history to see where you've been in the past. They would abuse flaws in the browser. Thankfully, many of the popular browser vendors have since fixed this flaw. But I'd like to ask my friends on the right-hand side of the panel, when you go to YouPorn or Morningstar or Charter Communications, some of the other companies that were doing it that were not engaged in that sort of sketchy side of the internet, were you agreeing to let those companies dig through your browsing history, or is that something that's a little bit too far?
So Chris must think that I sell cigarettes to children and asbestos on the weekend. I mean, it's just amazing, all the things that he assumes that I must want to defend. I mean, I think those examples are actually very good ones because they're fundamentally different from the case that Ryan is talking about, right? So I would actually tend to agree. This is precisely what I mean when I think about the common law of privacy and how I'd like to see it evolve. That, for example, if you go to a site and a company is actually, as you say, digging into your browser to expose a vulnerability there and pulling out history that's unrelated to visiting that particular site, I mean, that in principle, to me, sounds like something that might very well be objectionable. But hold on just a second, Chris. Could I just finish a sentence?
Yeah, Chris.
That's very different from what the value exchange, the quid pro quo that Ryan is getting at, that I've talked about as well, is first and foremost, there are two different issues. There's the understanding or the implied agreement that Ed is getting at. It's a very valid question. But there's also, and which is what I was getting at, there's a value exchange, right? The first value exchange is attention, and the second is the sharing of data, right? And those two things are basically paid by the consumer to the site that is providing free content and services to them. So that's the first thing that we're, to understand from our perspective. And then you have to ask the very fair question that Ed asked, which is there an understanding about what's going on? And I think that what Ryan is really trying to say is that if you go to a website, the fact that you visit that website is something that is, I think, validly collected by that website. Just as when you go to a store in the real world, or when you walk down a street, the people who are in that store or in that street or even here in this room, have a right to observe that you're there. So, I mean, as a basic philosophical matter.
Is that agreeable over here, that when you visit a first-party site, it's also their information, the fact that they had a visitor, and even all the information that's in the header that could be used to fingerprint, the IP address? Are we agreed that tracking by a first party, if you will, is normal and acceptable?
I think fingerprinting is nefarious.
Okay,
as long as consumers don't have a
like
means to opt out of it, I think it's problematic. But I think that the first party retaining information about the fact that you're visiting that site, I think that's fine, as long as they're not then sharing that with other third parties and allowing that to be used to correlate your activities across the web.
Then there's where the difference lies, because what Ed's question to Ryan was is how much is allowed? What is the contract? What is the deal?
Well,
how do we figure that out? Go ahead.
I just want to interject. I think everybody's characterization of what happens when you go to a website is definitely fair, and that's what happens. But as someone who represents consumers by building features for them, I don't think people, like, when they visit the sites that you mentioned, are thinking about quid pro quo or thinking about what the data exchange is at all. Like, I think largely users, I think awareness is growing, and there's been things like Wall Street Journal stories that help demonstrate that.
There have been Wall Street Journal stories?
But this is a really important point, right? A lot of this debate revolves around the assumption of perfect rationality. In other words, the idea that it's only fair if the consumer understands perfectly what's going on in every particular situation. And if you applied that rule throughout the economy, I mean, you couldn't have a modern economy, right? Because I don't understand how my engine works. I don't understand how credit card transactions work. I mean, if the classic essay on this is Leonard Read's famous essay, I, Pencil, where he tells the story of how a single pencil, which seems to be something so simple, is in fact impossible for a single person not only to build, but to know how to build, because it's such a complicated process. So when we talk about this, we really have to fundamentally understand that we're never going to have a complete understanding. The question is whether there are certain practices or acts. I mean, for example, Chris could pick out another set of things like selling asbestos, like respawning cookies via Flash, right? There are certain things like that I think we could agree are objectionable and that defy consumer expectations and the intent by a consumer not to be tracked. But to get back to Jim's fundamental question, we're here in this room. I don't own the fact that I'm in this room, right? I mean, all of this is a shared fact. Everybody sees me. And if you buy into a concept of property, an information that says that this is mine and nobody else can have it, and I can stop you from mentioning me or telling third parties, I mean, good heavens, you might tell people that that aren't here that I was here.
There was actually a CFP in Seattle several years ago where I tried to illustrate this point. Sorry to jump out of the role for a second. And I said, to illustrate how people own information about themselves while they hold it close and they give away information, well, the color of my underwear is information that I own, and I'll sell it to you for a nickel. Some bastard came up with $1. Bad news. But Harlan, I think you wanted to
Jimmy, can I just, I'm sorry to go on so long about this, but that's a key point, because you
can't go on too long about it.
You pick a good example about underwear, and the whole point here is you have shrouded the color of your underwear by wearing pants. And in a very real way, that's what this conversation, yay, thank you. I get one yay for today. But in a very real way, that's what this conversation is about. It's the extent to which you should be expected to do that.
And we support empowering Jim to wear pants.
Yay!
I mean, I think the guiding principle here really is about consumer expectations. What do consumers expect when they go to a site, whether it's first party or third party, and what they understand about the implicit quid quid pro quo. And I think a lot of consumers just don't understand what is actually happening in the background when a website loads. And I think there have been plenty of studies out there that show that consumers don't want this kind of tracking going on, that the majority of consumers think that this is harmful to their privacy. And I think that as a technical matter, do not track is just a better, more permanent mechanism to do all the things that we've been doing in the past. And I think, given that all 3 web browsers have implemented do not track capabilities in the browser, if the only thing that we get is that the do not track header is a replacement for the existing cookie opt-outs, where the server, when they receive it, just does the exact same thing as what they're currently doing with the opt-outs, I think we're already in a better place because consumers have better control. And so obviously there are other questions, and I would go above and beyond that in terms of what the policy should be when the server receives the header. But I think from a technical standpoint, the do not track train has left the station, and that that from a technical matter, it's just a better technology to help empower consumers.
I want to ask Andy where consumers are. I think maybe there's consensus that consumers don't know what's going on. Do you think they don't know what's going on, or are they expressing their preferences implicitly one way or another? Do you see anything in your work that shows that they want the kind of deal that Berin and Ryan suggest is okay? Where are they? What do we know?
I think it's easy for us, like on the panel and most of the audience, to look at a web page, and when you look at it, you see advertisement, you see search box, you see, all types of different things, and some people just have a feeling, this isn't part of the website, it's something else. I think there's a lot of people who are busy professionals who just want to get on the web and browse, and which is what kind of IE9 is all about. It's about websites and just getting on the net and doing your business. And I think that a lot of people don't think about those types of issues at all. I like the consumer studies that we've seen.
I'm not going to let you jump in. I'm going to ask Ed a question. But go on.
Go ahead.
No, I'm not letting him jump in.
No, I think if you tell a user what's going on when they visit a website, many users will say, I think that's creepy, or other users will say, I'm fine with that. I love ads. I love ads that are relevant to what I want to buy. And I think there are preferences that users have, but I think we're still a little ahead of the curve in terms of what users think of when they actually go to websites and whether or not they're conscious of what goes on.
FTC put out a report recently. You all think about what consumers think all the time. What's the inside dope?
Well, the question of what consumers think or understand in these settings is really an empirical question. And there are some studies on this that, at the risk of overgeneralization, I think tend to show a few things. One is that consumers don't want to bother with learning all of the details. 2 is that consumers think that they're better protected by the technology and the law than they actually are. One of the reasons why there is sometimes less furor about practices is that consumers think they're already illegal or already impossible. And I think the more often in the discussion about this, you'll hear people saying that, well, if we could just explain to consumers what we do with their data, how we gather it, and what we do, that would be okay. And to me, it depends. This is like the company that makes hot dogs saying that if we could just explain to people what's in the hot dogs, they would be happy to eat more of them. Well, that might or might not be true, depending on what's actually in the hot dogs.
So please, Jim, again, Hayek, I don't want to do nothing. There's plenty to do, right? So I'm not arguing against do not track. Just want to make that very clear, right? I'm arguing against the ways in which this could go and some of the philosophical underpinnings behind people who are pushing regulatory or legislative solutions. But this point about what consumers know, what they want, that these polls, this is really, really important. So in the law, there are 2 concepts that are very, very commonly confused. One is to ask, what do consumers actually know, and to base expectations on that. And the second is to ask instead, not what everybody actually knows, but what a certain sort of the rational, somewhat informed, reasonable person would know. Those are very different questions. And I think that we make a great mistake if we confuse rational ignorance on the part of most consumers, right? This is exactly the point that was made earlier, that people, they don't want to know how the engine in their car works or how the credit card system works. They just want to get through their day, and that's fine. The question is, how do you build a user empowerment tool that lets people choose, who are privacy sensitive, something that works for them, that lets them do that not at a cost, right? So that it's not free. There's a disincentive. There's a reason for them not to turn the dial all the way up to block. And then the key part here is, if you look at polls and you simply ask people, are you concerned about your privacy? Do you object to the following practices? And you conclude from that all of those practices are objectionable and should be banned, you're missing the key point about trade-offs, because that never, ever will be properly revealed in a poll. There's no way you can have a real-world trade-off.
I want to ask Berin, I want to ask Ryan to chime in on that if he's willing, because you've written a little bit about rational ignorance, and it was fascinating when I read this idea that people might not be paying attention because it might not matter. Sorry to say that here. Everybody's supposed to care 100%, right? But it might not matter. What about rational ignorance?
It might not matter. In fact, it might be a very good thing that, in some respects, that people don't spend lots of time learning about privacy, because time is scarce. And the world is full of risks, many of which are far greater than the relatively small threat that the data that's being collected about you by third parties will somehow harm you. People often don't understand exactly who's tracking them or why. And the reason they don't is because they haven't taken the time to educate themselves. And one of the biggest reasons they haven't taken the time is because they don't perceive subconsciously that it's worth their time, because there are many other greater risks. The current status quo with respect to how information is shared and collected and used on the internet is in large part the product of lots of people blissfully ignorant about how tracking works. When someone hears you're actually being tracked by a third party everywhere you go on the internet, they may be scared and think it's creepy. Maybe if they spend another year or many hours reading about it, they would realize that it's actually a fairly trivial risk and that the trade-off is worth it. But it's not necessarily the case that we should just assume that if consumers don't understand what's going on, that we're going to get an arrangement that is bad for society and bad for privacy and bad for consumer welfare.
There is outrage on my left. Go ahead.
So we should just give consumers choice and then let them decide, right?
Sounds like a gotcha question.
Yeah, well, look, again, nobody here is arguing against user empowerment.
Let me go to Chris.
Harlan, go quick.
I mean, the time is scarce argument sounds like an argument for do not track, right? Users shouldn't have to invest lots of time learning how to defend themselves. There are lots of different technologies. There's lots of different tools. It's probably inefficient for everyone to try to learn that. And so I think that's the beauty of do not track, is that it's a one-click, one-stop shop to defend against all of these activities. And so yes, it's about giving users easy control over these nefarious.
But Harlan, this is the crux of the debate. If it's a one-stop click, that I applaud Firefox for going out and doing this, Mozilla for doing that. But I think the way that they've rolled it out in the current iteration is a mistake, because it is a one-stop purports to block tracking everywhere. It doesn't actually do that, as we know. But I think that fundamentally is not the kind of user empowerment that we want. So really today what you're hearing is a debate between two forms of user empowerment. The folks over here on the left, I think at least on the far left, are in principle arguing for, I'm not lumping that in here, are in principle arguing for a form of user empowerment that is, go to this place, check one box, and block all tracking because tracking is bad and data is dangerous. And instead what I and I think Ryan are essentially arguing for is that ultimately what needs to happen in an evolved way, and I'm not going to dictate the design of this, but is some tool that is more granular than that is tailored towards real problems, and that is, in many ways, what's admirable about what Microsoft has done is that it's not that sort of one-size-fits-all blocking. It actually is intended to give people a diversity of options that reflect their real privacy preferences. And I think this is where Mozilla is heading, which is good, but today I'm not thrilled about it.
If you're up close, you can see the vein on Berin's forehead, and I can see the red in Chris's eyes.
Let me have one go real quick. All right, sorry. So if you listen to what Berin's saying, right, what he's describing is a desire to make it so that consumers have an option, but it's not too easy to use. Right? No. I guess my question back to Berin is, how much time should consumers have to spend to enable this option. And before you jump in, let me say that Microsoft has helped you in the past, right? So the previous versions of Internet Explorer required that you re-enable their tracking protection feature each time you started the browser. They made it so that the preference was not sticky. Not only was it not on by default, but you had to re-enable it every time. So is 5 minutes for every browsing session, is that the right cost? Is 5 hours spent downloading third-party plugins
briefly confirmed that
the right amount of time?
true.
What is the right amount?
So let's back up one step before I answer your questions and recognize that what we're really talking about here is creating a market, right? So when Ryan was saying that we have an implicit quid pro quo today, what he really means is that there is, in economic terms, there is no exact structure to the market. There is no explicit negotiation. It's only that if you are privacy sensitive, you can use tools that exist today to opt out. And essentially what we're moving towards is the flip side of do not track is basically to say, I prefer to pay, or I prefer to see more ads that are less relevant, but they're more annoying, or something like that. So that negotiation is going to have to evolve for this to be scalable, which is what I meant earlier. And what I'm ultimately saying is that you can't expect this tool to work if there's no reason for the user not to turn the dial all the way up to block. If you give them something that simply says, I don't want any tracking at all, and there's no cost to that, people are not going to make a rational trade-off. They're going to simply check the box because it's easy, or because, as the Europeans want, it's checked by default in all browsers.
Harlan, you.
I think so to clarify the technology...
I'm not sure were you clapping for me or against me?
Berin for the Europeans. That makes no sense, you people.
To clarify just the technology just a little bit, I think the basic use of the do not track header for the lay user, for my mom, would be the binary setting. It'd be I don't want to be tracked by third parties, or I do. I think for advanced users, you could actually use it in very much the same way as tracking protection lists, where you could have granular settings about when to send the header and when not to send the header. You could set it only to certain third parties, or only to certain third parties when they're on other first-party sites that you can specify. And so in some ways, the header is just as granular as TPLs. It's just that for the lay user who wants the default protection, can just turn it on for all third parties. The same thing could be done with TPLs, where it blocks all requests to third parties. And so in terms of granularity, both the tracking protection lists and the do not track header actually offer very much the same.
So just to be clear, we need to distinguish here between the header, and Harlan's exactly right. Okay, header can be used in a granular fashion in that way, and the user interface, which is to which websites is the header sent. And my complaint is not necessarily about the header, although it might be that the header doesn't well facilitate the kind of transaction that needs to take place. My complaint is first and foremost about the interface, because if the interface is primarily block or don't block, that's not where we want to go, and I think that's not where Mozilla is heading, to their credit. I think they're moving towards a more granular thing that allows people to express their preferences better.
Mozilla is going to offer granular settings for advanced users, but Harlan's mother and my mother are not going to want to spend 2 hours configuring their browser preferences. And I think what you're arguing, I think what you're saying is the default should be something really complex, so that technically trained users will spend those 2 hours figuring out how to do it, but it'll overwhelm the average user, and they'll stick with the default, which is to allow...
Hang on, I'm a little confused. Are you saying that someone should stop Mozilla from doing this?
No, absolutely not. Again, I want plans by the many, not plans by the few. I'm not arguing against Mozilla doing something, but that doesn't mean that I don't have the right to suggest that they could do it better. And it also doesn't mean that when I'm expressing this, I may not be expressing it as I am here, a concern that government has essentially forced them or driven them to do things in a way that is suboptimal. In other words, Mozilla could be doing it in a different and better way. And let me go back again to the...
I can tell you the FTC is not ordering Mozilla to design their interface.
It's not a question of ordering. See, this was my point earlier by saying that if we look here only for government diktat, explicit orders, we're missing the bigger picture of the more forms of subtle pressure that are brought to bear, especially by our friends over on Capitol Hill, who like to hold hearings to bully companies to do things, sometimes good, and sometimes they end up doing things that are not done in the best way. But let me get back just for a moment to the debate about child safety and parental controls. Nobody is saying in that debate that every single parent everywhere in America should have to come up with the list for themselves of websites that are not appropriate for their children. Instead, we have a system in which parents are given tools that allow them very easily to subscribe to, you might think of them as whitelists and blacklists, that reflect their preferences and that are, say, curated that's appropriate for a Mormon family or a kid that's between 10 and 13. And that's the kind of thing ultimately that I think makes sense in a world where people are rationally ignorant. We do want to give them simple options. And what I mean by that concretely is it could be a tool that, let's say, the Electronic Frontier Foundation or Chris, because Chris is good at building user empowerment tools. It could be something like that that's offered that says, here are the sites that you should block if you're concerned about companies that have dastardly privacy practices like respawning your cookies and all those sorts of things. That would be a wonderful way to roll this out.
Let me ask you, Andy, where are we at with tracking protection lists? How many are there? What kind of diversity is there right now in the universe of lists that are? I guess the system is shipping with IE9, which a lot of people are getting with their updates right now.
Right. We just shipped a few months ago, okay. But there are already a number of tracking protection lists on the web. That number continues to grow. We want to see more tracking protection lists, like more. We have a site that aggregates some of them on iegallery.com, and you can go pick from one there.
Say that URL once again.
It's iegallery.com.
Face the microphone and say that URL once again.
iegallery.com.
Thank you, Moderator. This is one of the roles that I play.
But that's just an aggregation site that we put up. Anybody could put up a site that offers any number of tracking protections.
It's reminiscent to me, and I'm really relatively ignorant on this, but it's reminiscent of the spam wars back in the day when you used to have, blocking lists for different relays and spam originators. Are there any of those problems emerging in tracking protection lists? Because I could see someone putting out a list that is excessive or that blocks based on controversial reasons and things like that. Is there what's happening in that area?
Yeah, I think. That's another reason why having more aggregation sites is a good thing, and definitely we'd encourage, trustworthy entities to do that. There is a risk if you're a user, like you should download a tracking protection list from somebody that you trust. People trust, do trust on the web today. I think that's reasonable, but the more choices that are out there, the better.
Jim?
I want to go to the economics for a little bit and then talk about vision, but then we'll get to your questions, and so be thinking of questions and be ready to stand on the yay side or boo side. You don't have to commit to one or the other to ask a question, but please, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you made the comparison to spam, because I used to have to download updated spam lists on a regular basis, and now I sign up for an email service, and my email provider automatically scans and erases all the spam messages. Google manages all of that for me. I don't have to enable any preferences. I don't have to enable spam protection. I don't even have to assemble a blacklist. Google does it for me. Now, channeling sort of Berin's argument here, what about the spammers? What about those poor guys selling Viagra who are being denied a living, right? Think of these people who are losing money because they're not able to reach consumers. This is free speech. But no, we've decided that spam protection should be easy to use, and the default should be the one that we think most consumers
Berin,
want.
You don't need to respond. He's made that argument. You've responded to it before.
There's no trade-off there.
That's fine. Let's talk about economics, because we haven't really talked about what advertising supports, and there is an argument. I wrote in my notes to the group that the kinds of questions I would ask are like, boo side, why do you think that the internet is just a tool corporations should use to dine on the entrails of the hapless consumer? Yay side, what did the internet do to you that makes you want to strangle it and drown it in the bathtub? Wouldn't, and this is where the economics kick in. Wouldn't cutting back on the advertising business model really wreck lots of the cool free stuff that we get? I don't know why I phrased the question that way, but boo side, this is the death of the internet, is it not?
If lots of people make a low-cost opt-out, it would have huge repercussions for the business model that sustains the internet. Information is a non-rival good. Yes, there's a value exchange when you share information about you, but assuming it's not being used to harm you, you're not actually losing anything of value. However, when you pay money to a company to subscribe to their content, you're poorer. You do receive a benefit, but it's not the same economically. So there may be a very good reason, there likely is, for the status quo on the internet, where information sharing and advertising is the single biggest source of funding for an array of content and other services that consumers enjoy.
Yeah, let me just put that another way. I mean, advertising has always been the mother's milk of media, and it's for the reason that Ryan is getting at in economic terms, which is that basically it's very difficult to get people to fund advertising content by paying for it. Raw information is very difficult to support in that way because, again, it's easily copied. So basically it's rational that you have a business model of selling attention next to the content. The problem ultimately here gets down to a simple economic analysis. So Ronald Coase, father-in-law in economics, basically taught us that in a world with no transactions cost, so this sort of fantasy land that doesn't exist, it doesn't matter where you set opt-in, opt-out. None of those things matter because you end up getting the same outcomes because markets are perfect and they arrive at the same solution. And his point in saying that was markets are not perfect, and we have real transactions costs. And so my point in saying this is to say that when you start changing the way that the marketplace works, it's a mistake to assume that, okay, well, you'll have exactly the same amount of funding because people who want to pay for something will provide the same amount of revenue that was otherwise provided by advertising. That's not how it works, right? The reality is building these systems, the explicit quid pro quo of if I say I don't want to be tracked and I prefer to pay and you charge me, building that costs money. You're probably likely to get less revenue. And in the end, it's really not clear how big the effect is going to be, but the stakes are high. And I think that certain people, like Jonathan Mayer, have done a certain disservice here to the stakes by saying, oh, well, behavioral advertising is only $1 billion a few years ago, and it's a $25 billion ad market. Kind of misses the fact that what we're really talking about is display advertising, just about $7 billion. And that behaviorally targeted ad revenue figure is growing quite substantially. So it's not unreasonable to expect that for the next few years we could be talking about a significant percentage of display ad revenue, which is the revenue that websites rely on to fund their operations. It's different from search revenue and other forms of advertising. That's what's at stake here. And again, I worry that the implementation, the particular configuration of do not track and the user interface makes a big difference for those economics. And we don't understand it well, and I'd hate to rush in and lose a lot of the money that funds free content and service.
Yay side, won't you tell us how overwrought that argument is?
Yes, that argument is overwrought.
Go into specifics.
I guess my difference with Berin here is that I just trust the market more. Let me explain why. If you give consumers a choice about whether they want to be tracked without their consent, then there can be a negotiation between the consumer and that publisher or advertiser. And the publisher or advertiser can say, well, let me explain to you the benefits of doing this, and let me explain to you what my practices are. I promise not to use the data in the following 5 ways that you find difficult. And the publisher, the advertiser, has an opportunity to make that pitch to the consumer and to get them to agree that it's worth consenting to the advertisement in order to, or it's worth consenting to be tracked in order to have access to that site. If the consumer feels that it's not worth, if the publisher says, I'm sorry, you're going to have to let me do whatever I want with this data as a condition of visiting the site, the consumer may just go away. The point is that the market can work this out, that there can be, that advertisers will figure out what promises they have to make in order to offer a deal that actually is good for consumers when consumers have the choice. Instead of somebody sitting here on a podium and saying this is a good deal for consumers, we can find out by letting consumers actually choose.
The one interesting thing to think about in that scenario, though, is that then when you visit the Wall Street Journal, they'd have to say, hey, would you mind if we allow 38 different companies to track you while you're here? And that might be a little bit unpleasant for sites to have to admit, what they're facilitating and enabling on their sites. But I do think that, if there's a player that's in a position to give consumers a pitch for enabling these things, it's the ad companies, right? If they can talk you into spending $29.95 for a slank hit, or whatever they're showing at 2 a.m. in the morning on TV.
How did you know? How did you know? How did you know?
They can get you.
How did you know?
To opt in.
Andy, what do you think of that approach? Can this be bargained out through a do not track mechanism?
I think it has to happen. I mean, the alternative is that we like it just stays hidden. Like it's out there. People are learning about it, and I think the most important thing is that consumers, when they go do transactions and they do commerce on the internet, that they trust it. So if consumers don't trust the web because they feel like they can't make choices about their privacy, then they won't use it. And then your economic arguments don't work.
One of the things I've heard from the Boo side that I haven't heard the opposite to on the Yay side, Boo side says no legislation, no regulation, and no none of this like arm-twisting pressure. But I haven't heard a lot of we need legislation, we need regulation on the Yay side. Do we need legislation? Do we need regulation? Do we need arm-twisting?
I mean, I think giving more money and more authority to the FTC would be a good thing, but I'm a realist, and I don't think anything's happening in D.C. in the next year or two.
Cash contributions to Ed Felton may be handed over to him after the program.
I mean, from my point of view, it seems like we've given industry quite a lot of opportunities to try to provide adequate control to consumers, and at this point, I don't believe consumers have that. And so I'm not certain that legislation is the right answer, but I also don't think that self-regulation itself will be sufficient.
Harlan says there has to be regulation. What do you guys say?
Well, again, I want FTC enforcement, and I think actually one place where I would agree with Chris is that if I remember I asked earlier why the FTC hasn't gone after companies for lying in their P3P policy statements. If that's because they don't have the technical resources and Ed needs more assistance and people like Chris, I'm all in favor of giving the FTC those resources, right? I mean it when I say I'm serious about user empowerment and enforcement of existing laws to start with. And I'm not against do not track in principle. I do have to respond on the economics. When Ed says that he trusts the market here, I mean, as a practical matter, I agree that probably that some form of this has to happen. My point, though, is to say that when one says I trust the market, one can mean I trust the market to basically come up with this, the same equilibrium. That's not going to happen because it's costly, right? So, and the extent to which it's costly depends on how many people use this and how it's configured. So once again, I come back to the configuration. If it's a blanket opt-out of everybody, it's going to be more costly and it's going to have a larger effect on revenue than if it were configured in a different way that makes people think a little more carefully, or at least, for example, has the kind of list that I mentioned earlier, where the list that is blocked using the do not track mechanism is a list that's based on some concept of real harm, as determined by our friends at EFF or Chris or whoever else anybody wants to subscribe to, just as I can download the Mormon parental control filter.
I do want to try to preserve debate here, so I wanted to send a question down to Ryan. Ryan, do you support an increase in the FTC's budget for the coming fiscal year?
I support reallocation of resources from the Competition Bureau to the Consumer Protection Bureau.
Wow.
Wow. I will add that the notion the markets can sort this out is absolutely correct. But when FTC and Congress are talking about we need more privacy, we need do not track, what they're doing is distorting the set of arrangements that would otherwise emerge. In some ways, they're even increasing misinformation among consumers by refocusing the privacy debate to a series of potential risks that really aren't the ones that we should be the most concerned about. They're making markets less effective, not more effective, by being involved. There are good reasons why consumers need more choices, and to the extent that those choices should exist, they are and will continue to emerge over time. The last thing that the companies that make money off the internet want is for consumers to stop trusting the internet and use it less.
So I disagree there, because if John Leibowitz, chairman of the FTC, hadn't mentioned that the concept of do not track in a speech before the Senate last July, we wouldn't have this technology in 3 of the browsers. The browsers responded directly to pressure from Washington. And in fact, Tim Wu has a really interesting paper that he just released a few weeks ago on agency threats. So regulatory threats, not regulatory regulation. And I think it's fascinating, the power of a single speech. And I think we have to thank the FTC for where we are today. I think it would be great if they had the power to enforce this, but I think we actually have to give them a shout out for pushing the browser vendors who dragged their feet for years on these issues. And of course, the reason the browser vendors drag their feet is because many of them are ad networks themselves or funded directly by ad networks. So
that's not inconsistent with Ryan's point, which is that might be a distortion in the market where we should be focusing
right. It is
on lots
a distortion in the force, but it's a positive one.
All right, it's a distortion you want. That's fine.
But listen, I mean, I don't support that sort of regulatory bullying or intimidation. But one can at least make a nuanced argument to say that hanging the sword of Damocles might, in some situations, do do good, but you don't actually want a regulatory or legislative mandate. There is a tenable middle ground that I can respect, and I think that's one that really would take cognizance of the dangers in having the government get involved in dictating design, and recognize that instead this is much better left to the standard-setting process that has made the internet work thus far.
But the FTC only has 1.5 technologists. They're never going to design the standard.
Yeah, but I'm not arguing it's a straw man. There is legislation pending that would actually have the FTC get involved in how this works, and the Europeans certainly want to do the same. I'm not inventing this fantasy.
I would like to get questions from the audience now. We have some.
I have one.
Step up to the microphones.
I have one thing. I think this is a wonderful panel. I so enjoyed it. There's one thing I'd like to add for the non-tech crowd. We hear this stuff all the time, and we know what you mean when you say HTTP or header and all of that. If you have your computer on and you're watching streaming and you have no clue what they're talking about, click View. Go down to Page Source, click Page Source. It's going to open up a window. That stuff you're looking at is HTTP. If you look 3 lines down, there's a caret, a sideways pyramid that has head in it, and it has a caret afterwards. And if you look all the way down, it has a matching thing that says caret/head. That's the header. That's my
Very
comment.
helpful, Lily. Technical explanation.
That's actually not the header, but we can talk more. That's the head section in the HTTP spec of a web page.
HTML spec.
In the HTML spec. Sorry, it's tough using existing tools for consumers to see the communication stream between the browser and servers, which is one of the reasons that consumers don't know how many companies are tracking them. There's no way to figure out easily how many different companies are tracking you on page.
It's why we still appreciate the work of nerds.
There are good tools.
In Internet Explorer, you can click Tools, Safety, and then View Web Page Privacy Policy, and that'll give you a pretty good list of all the third-party content.
There's a reasonably good browser plugin called Ghostery that if you install will actually at least make a little bit more transparent to the user what third-party connections are being made every time you load a website.
Cool tools. Identify yourself if you want to. I'm a privacy and identity privacy guy, so you don't have to identify yourself to speak in my panel.
Jay Stanley with the ACLU, and I'm just disappointed that my startup hasn't been successful because the startup I wanted to plan because users just haven't been given enough opportunity for trade-offs. I was going to set up a startup where you create transcripts of everybody's phone calls and use that to market to them. And not only do users not able to make trade-offs there, but in fact the government has taken away our opportunity to make trade-offs by making that illegal, and probably cut out entire economic marketplaces that could be flourishing and making our phone calls more expensive. And in fact,
phone calling.
My point is, obviously, there's no reason that anybody really wants to be tracked on the internet as they move around the internet.
Right,
that is a social decision that we. Let me finish my question. Let me finish my question, please.
Answer.
So that is a social decision that we as a society made, which is that. Let me finish my question. Wait. My point. Okay. And my point is that that's a social decision that we've made, and we can make a similar decision with regards to the internet that nobody really wants to be tracked as they go around the internet. There is no question that the private sector, if we unleash it, will become better and better. That capitalism will become incredibly good at spying on citizens and on consumers. It will be moved to a very refined level. We don't want citizens to have to get into an arms race
in the form of a question,
with
please.
Companies. And so isn't it true that we should isn't it true that we should impose our basic values on internet tracking just as we have with phone call tapping?
Okay, so what are those? So what are those basic values, and whose are they? Because we've been down this road before. I mean, this was in large part the debate over Gmail, where our friends at Epic thought it was basically unconscionable that I should be able to use an internet service that algorithmically scans the contents of my email to deliver advertising to fund an internet email service that was unprecedented in its quality and its innovation. Okay? They wanted to say, let's use our basic values to stop that. And hundreds of millions of people disagreed, right, and are using that service and love it. So the argument that you're starting from, this whole, we can't have any sort of tracking or any sort of analysis of content, I think is fundamentally misplaced.
We're not
because
there
are real trade-offs here. There are many values, and your values are not the only ones.
We're not going to have a back-and-forth argument because we've got a lot of questions. Sir?
A couple of John Wunderlich from Toronto. First off, I think the entire economic and market discussion is misplaced, because the real market is not between the consumer and the website, because there's no exchange of money. The real market is between the website and the ad companies, and that market's working perfectly fine, thank you very much. This is like a debate about how pretty do you want the shearing chute as the pigs go, because we're not consumers, we're the product. So I think the economic point misses there. Also, when you assert that there must be real harm, there are those that think that privacy is a right and that risk-based harm decisions are an inappropriate metric. But the question I want to ask is, if we apply, and please take my question as is, don't recast as what I really mean is, what happens when you take this consumer choice empowered, the companies do all of that, and instead of applying it in commercial transactions in the United States or Canada, you apply this same free for unregulated, and the website can do whatever they want, if that's a fair interpretation, in authoritarian regimes where the use of the internet serves real purposes for democracy and has real risks for people that are using it. And if they want not to be tracked, that's a life or death decision. And I think this approach doesn't work in those circumstances.
That's a big question. It's a lot of question, but somebody down there's got to have a couple of answers.
I think you hit on the greatest threat to privacy, which is that the state will acquire information that we've shared. The problem with, for instance, having our phone calls transcribed and being used to market to us isn't that that's inherently a harmful thing. It's that that information could be misused. That's the risk. When government is using that to spy on us or to prosecute us for doing things that shouldn't be illegal in the first place, that's a real problem. And in the case of authoritarian regimes, that problem was all the more magnified. That's why we need to focus on limiting government access to information to allow companies that want to be good stewards of data to do so. Today they can't do that, as Senator Leahy will discuss.
And I'm proud to say that both Ryan's organization, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, my organization, TechFreedom, and a number of other free market and libertarian organizations have joined with groups in the center and in the left to advocate for reforming exactly those laws. So we've put our money where our mouth is. We're serious about building a higher wall between government and privately stored data, because it is a real threat. But just to your other point, I would say when I argue and when Ryan talks about harms, I don't mean harm in the narrow economic term. I would really encourage you to read Howard Beale's excellent paper. Howard ran the Bureau of Consumer Protection in the early 2000s. Who paid for that paper? And wrote a wonderful paper explaining that the concept of harm, as it was originally developed in the FTC, was not limited, for example, to monetary damages, but rather was intended to refer to many of the kinds of situations we've talked about here today, and that the FTC, in a somewhat perverse way, is actually sort of narrowly construed that concept to say that it's limited by that sense, that definition of harm, and therefore it needs new authority. So instead, I would say actually that the FTC has a robust way of going after real harms, even when they're not economic.
Next question, sir.
I'm Vaibhav Cook from Indiana University. One thing I'd like to point out is when I thought there was going to be a debate, I thought it was going to be between how lame and weak the current do not track effort is and whether we need a stronger one. I never thought it would be between whether we need one and we don't need one.
We apologize.
And on the other hand, I would like to point out, I come from a psychological background, and so one of the problems is that it's an opt-in. And if you look at psychological literature, as long as it's opt-in, most users are actually not going to actually use it. Most users are not going to care about it. And in which case, I really think it should be it should be an opt-out, because if the idea is if it adds value to the consumer, right? That's the idea, that advertising and tracking adds values to the consumer. It creates differentiated products that are more marketable and they're more targeted. Then the consumer themselves would rationally, if you're using the rational argument, they would themselves then opt in, and they would decide that they would be tracked. As for the economic argument that has been made, that it's not...
Why is everyone trying to do two questions? Go ahead, but this is the last time I'm going to accept two questions.
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about that. Then I'm going to talk about the primary thing that everyone's been talking about, that it reduces choices. I'm appalled that the left did not make this point. Tracking actually does not increase choices, and this is where the technologists should read sociology literature. Tracking actually decreases choices in many instances. For example, I'll give you the example of with Google advertising, if you are a person who is left-leaning and liberal, you're only going to see when you do a Google search, you're only going to see results that are left-leaning.
We get it.
Right. All right. So that was my point. So choice is not always increased.
I want to hear from Chris on this set of questions.
So I think it's interesting to note that there is a question as to whether this should be opt-in or opt-out. And I think my friends on the right here, not only do they want this to be opt-in, but they also want you to crawl through broken glass before you can enable the option.
And asbestos.
And asbestos. They really are evil. Let's hear one question from you, sir.
Pedro Leon from Carnegie Mellon University. I want to ask about enforcement from the FTC perspective, because I think regulations are very expensive and nobody wants them. But self-regulation is clearly not working. So why is that the case that the FTC is not able to punish those companies who are not behaving correctly? Is it a problem of budget? Is it a problem of authority? Why is that?
Well, let me talk generally about enforcement policy. First of all, the FTC does not have a general mandate to punish badness, much as we would like to have it, I suppose. There are specific statutes that give the FTC authority, and enforcement actions have to fit within the confines of those statutes and the case law. That's number one. Number two is the question of resources, and I'm glad to hear that everyone here seems to agree that at least in matters of consumer protection, the FTC would benefit from more resources, because in fact decisions do get made that we would love to enforce in situation X, but we just don't have the resources. And those are the two things really that that primarily limit the ability to enforce in practice.
See, I've just been holding my tongue because I'm in a moderator's role about your budget, man. But go ahead, Chris.
So I'd actually like to make the case that do not track is good for business. And so there was a recent FTC enforcement case against a company called Chitika. Chitika is an online behavioral advertising network. They offered an opt-out cookie on their website, and the cookie expired after 10 days. The FTC, I think, rightfully said that, if you're going to offer an opt-out cookie to consumers, it should be effective. It shouldn't expire after 10 days. If companies embrace the do not track header, they don't have to be responsible for the effectiveness of the opt-out cookie on their site. They don't have to be responsible for if the cookie disappears, or if the IT team changed the web page and suddenly the cookie isn't available anymore. When you agree to respect the header, you really move all of the effort and responsibility for setting and transmitting the header to the browser vendor. It's their problem. They're the ones who have to deal with the FTC if consumers aren't able to set it. This is a great thing for companies.
Did we even get to what it means to respect the header? What is respect the header?
That was the good part. We didn't have to get bogged down on that.
So we hated on the idea that there's an implicit quid pro quo, but we didn't make explicit what the quid pro quo is in the header. Failure of your moderator once again. Question.
Hi, my name's Deborah. So my question is I think one of the things we're talking about, like economies, regarding like these advertising models and tracking. What is the monetary value of information? Because obviously these advertising models are getting more rich data than they did in the past. And zoom out from computers. Let's forget about computers. I mean, look at other advertising models from like TV to telemarketing. We have do not call. Why? Because one, it impedes on you. It's disturbing. But only that, they're just trying to get information from you so that they can build their marketing database. So if this is, it's the model increasing, but as we say, there is monetary value to that information. So you are giving something that is of value to these advertisers. So should you or should you not be compensated in some way? In the previous models, you were given, you were able to get something from it.
But that's the whole point. You are compensated. That's what we were talking about when we were talking about the implicit value exchange. You're getting content and services. I mean, the central challenge that I see that's being ignored here is the dilemma of how you fund media at a time when the internet ruthlessly drives prices to zero and makes it increasingly difficult to actually fund anything. And it's particularly ironic because the FTC itself, and on the other side of the house, has been obsessed with this very question about journalism. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect here, left hand, right hand. the way you square these two things is to recognize that when you empower users on privacy, as I really do believe you should do, you have to keep in mind this dilemma, that the exchange you just asked about is attention and data for content. And if you muck with that exchange, you're going to get less content, less diversity of content. And I don't think that's good for our democracy, to answer the question that was asked
I think
earlier.
it should be a choice. Isn't that democracy?
We're not going to do debates. We only have 3 or 4.
I think also at the end of the day, what it leaves standing is the only source of funding is government funding, which is not good for democracy.
We only have 3 or 4 more minutes, so let's do a lightning round. No, it won't be that. But
I'm disturbed that I've heard a number of disingenuous arguments, and I won't run through them.
But Chris is the disingenuous monitor here. Hasn't he done his job?
Well, no. I mean, I've heard a number of arguments for people who should. I mean, there are a number of arguments that have been stated that people who understand the marketplace. It seems to me that a deeper understanding of the marketplace, which I assume everybody here has, it's clear that you're arguing in favor of getting what you want rather than making an argument. And the specific thing that I'll bring up, I mean, I have a list. I can't go through them. The specific thing that I'll bring up, though, is that we're discussing about, what's the harm of somebody having your address or having these small bits of data, whether it's opt-in, opt-out, all these technological issues. And to me, the real harm is the fact that once you have my address, the fact that I took a bus today, that I'm carrying a smartphone, all these individual bits of data, you can then start building psychological profiles and data mine me to build a profile that is far more intrusive than what these small bits of data are. And we know that this is what the marketing companies are doing.
Form of a question, please.
The question is, why are we discussing these individual data bits, and why are we not discussing these massive profiles that are 30, 40, 50 pages long that are being built by these third-party companies? Because that, to me, is the real harm, and it's not being addressed by Do Not Track except to cut off the wellspring. And it's certainly not being discussed by the boo side.
Harlan, you're noodling around the edges.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think it's it's about these profiles that are being built, not necessarily about the advertising. The advertising is the most conspicuous, the most obvious use of this data, but obviously in the background it's being used in lots of other ways as well that users just never see and can't get outraged about because they don't know that it's there. And I think another point I want to make is that regulating use may not be enough. I mean, I think the collection itself and the building of the dossier is already a problem. I mean, we've seen in the past couple of months, numerous, data breaches and accidental loss. So I think just having rules around, how this information can be used after it's collected may not be enough to protect the consumers from privacy harms.
And these dossiers are not only harmful, they can be hugely beneficial. The public access to credit has been widely democratized over the past few decades because precisely of dossiers that have been built about individuals' financial history, and that's been on net a wonderful
thing. With the 45 seconds we have remaining, we're going to hear his question, and then everybody's going to speak for 1 second each, and then wrap up.
I have two questions, but I'll only ask one of them.
Thank you.
And I'll ask the one that I think is most likely to be answered in an interesting way, which is I haven't really heard very much about. I understand the technology of headers and Do Not Track, but I haven't heard how this becomes something that will meaningfully cut back on tracking. Whether it's through legislation, regulation, industry standards. I haven't really heard that discussed very much, and I'd like that addressed.
That's a good question. Let's hear you two.
Hi, I'm Cliff from Shazzle. On the legislation about preventing a government from accessing privately created data banks on citizens, isn't there a risk that if that government turns authoritarian that it won't respect laws, and that's part of the problem? So how do you protect against the government misusing information if you get to the point where that's exactly what the government wants to do? And isn't there a risk of creating, even if they're private data banks, once they exist, isn't that a temptation for the government to overreach?
Two very good questions.
Right, so Google's outside lawyer, Al Gadari, says if you build it, they will come. I mean, he's quoting someone else. But don't collect the data in the first place.
Harlan, answer those two questions in 5 words.
I mean, I agree. Don't collect the data. If it's not there, government can't have access to it.
And you can't lose it.
Maybe it is a partial answer to your question. Ed, you got 5 words to wrap this thing up, baby. I just called Ed Felton baby.
Thanks. To me, this discussion is indicative of where the whole debate on this issue is going. It's not about whether consumers should have choice. The debate is moving to how best to provide that choice for consumers. If a consumer wants to protect themselves from tracking, let them do it. But now let's talk about how that should be done.
Andy, honey?
Choice, yay.
Choice, yay. Very nice. Berin.
Empowerment, education, enforcement of existing laws, erecting a higher wall of separation between government and privately stored data, and taking enforcement seriously and enhancing self-regulation in the broad sense that I mean it, of how companies respect the header, of how companies reform their data practices, and also expecting that the do not track mechanism will lead to better data practices because, again, companies, what I meant before, EFF, can come up with a list of companies that have good data practices and they won't get blocked. That's a useful way to improve the marketplace.
Ryan.
Government is much, much better at tracking us than stopping us from being tracked.
During the lunch hour, there are a couple of great sessions you'll want to check out in Room A. Youth, Privacy, and Freedom, Using Libraries to Engage Young People. In Room B, Meet the Robins versus Lower Merion School District. And then we'll be back here at 2 o'clock for a session that should be great entertainment and education. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to my panel, Chris Soghoian, Harlan Yu, Ed Felton, Andy Ziegler, Berin Szoka, and Ryan Radia.
This is